Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered podcast. Today I'm joined by Cameron Riker, who runs a prominent Catholic YouTube channel, to talk about my recent video talking about how the Catholic Church doesn't know what would send you to hell and why I think that's a problem. And so today Cameron and I are going to be talking through that issue, and welcome to the show, Cameron.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
And if you could give people, before we dive into this discussion, people would know me as somebody who's left Catholicism, but if you could intro yourself in a few sentences to my audience before we hop in, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so my name's Cameron Riker. I cradle Catholic, grew up Catholic, never had a conversion. I did have a reversion, though. There were several years where I was not living according to the church's teachings, and through dating a Protestant, actually, and having to learn how to defend my faith against Protestantism, that's how I started to get into Catholicism a little more. So I quickly became very, very convinced in the truths of the Catholic faith. Went into seminary. God said, thanks for the application, but no thank you. And then discerned out and got married. Now I live in Arizona with my wife and two beautiful children. So yeah, and then for my YouTube channel, I just do apologetics and basically anything that young Catholic men will be interested in. That's kind of what I talk about.
That's awesome. And I think today's discussion will be fruitful. And I've tried to talk to a few Catholics about doing an interview on this topic, but as you know, the average level of catechesis for Catholics is not super great. So it's awesome to have somebody like you who's studied the faith and knows what the teachings are. And for the audience first hitting this video, essentially the thesis of my video, which I'll have linked down below, is that in Catholicism there's this idea of venial versus mortal sins, or venial versus grave sins, depending on how you want to parse the language, in that there are things that in principle could send you to hell, or at least make you liable to it. And I think if that's part of a religion, there should be clear guidelines around what is or isn't potentially going to send you to hell. And it seems like to me, even among faithful Catholics that I've talked to, that they don't agree on what constitutes a grave sin or what grave sins become mortal sins is kind of the thesis of that video. And I'll hand it to you, Cameron, if you want to either explain more about grave and venial sins, or we can dive right into what some holes that you might see in my argument.
Yeah, so there's a couple things just for the audience to understand. The distinction between a mortal and a venial sin is something that people may not be familiar with. A mortal sin is a sin that breaks your relationship with God. So to make an analogy with marriage, which is often used, is if you forget to do the dishes, right? Your wife forgets to do the dishes and you wake up the next morning like, oh, the sink is full. You're not going to divorce her for that, right? It's like, that doesn't break the relationship. It may be a nuisance, but it doesn't break the relationship. Whereas if your wife is chronically having affairs with other men, you can't in good conscience maintain that relationship in that way, right? Yeah. It breaks the relationship. There's a fundamental shattering that occurs. And it's the same in our relationship with God. There are certain things that are not according to God's will that we can do that they don't make God not our Father anymore, right? It's not like he's kicking us out of the household because we, said something to our kids that was a little bit harsher than we should have whenever we're disciplining them or something like that. But if we are, worshiping other gods, breaking the 6th and 9th commandment, et cetera, all these things that the church would consider grave matter, that's going to shatter our relationship with God. So that's a very simplistic way of understanding the distinction between mortal and venial sin before we hop in. I hope that's helpful for your audience. But yeah, go ahead now. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, and then probably another distinction that'll be helpful for people listening is a grave matter versus a mortal sin. So for something to be a mortal sin that sends you to hell, it has to have grave matter. So it's, I think like laws out there, there's rules on the book, and in order to be convicted, like you first have to do the actual act, and then you have to do that with full knowledge and full consent, which I find, and this would be a very different discussion, that even those are kind of suspect and not well defined. But the idea is like a grave sin. Let's say I think I used the car example in my video, where if you accidentally hit somebody with your car, both in law and in how the Catholic Church might see it, you might be responsible for negligence, or you should have checked more. But if you didn't understand and you weren't grossly negligent, you're not fully responsible as if you had first intended to run somebody over. Is a very different discussion. Right. So something could be a grave, or an act that has grave material to it, but if it's not full knowledge and full consent, then it's not going to send you to hell. And so a lot of Catholics, when I first lay out this example, they're like, well, there's a difference between a grave and a mortal sin, which I agree with. But my problem is even in principle that it's not clear what constitutes grave matter for the various acts out there. So some examples to bring this into the real world. I'll pull up my handy dandy notes here. Something that I use in the video as an example is dancing. In my fraternity parish in Denver, ballroom dancing, A-OK, because it was old-timey and cool. In Idaho, though, I'm pretty sure those folks see dancing as sinful or potentially even mortally sinful. When it comes to can you attend non-Catholic worship and in what capacity? Some people, the more Bellarmine approach, are like you're going to automatically excommunicate yourself. Some people are like ecumenism. With reading non-Catholic materials, some examinations of consciences say you can't ever consume anti-Catholic material. Some say you can for apologetic purposes. For natural family planning or what married couples can and can't do inside of the bedroom, somebody like Alphonsus Liguori is going to disagree with somebody like Christopher West on what acts are okay as foreplay. And so my kind of central thesis is that it seems problematic that faithful Catholics can disagree upon what could in principle send you to hell. I gave the example, it's like going through the world and you don't know if a speeding ticket could make you liable for capital punishment, or fudging your tax returns could get you the capital punishment, versus obviously intentionally killing somebody is something that can get you capital execution in various states. So I'm really happy to either clarify my stance or if we want to dive into
I
some
think
disagreement on it.
I think if I could just recap your stance briefly, just to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly before I respond. Essentially what you're saying is that there is disagreement depending on who you ask, even within the official magisterium of the church, right? Like a priest is considered an official member of the magisterium, obviously a lower level, but there's disagreement among the official magisterium of the church about what constitutes grave matter or not, and that's important to know. And therefore, since we can't have certainty about what's grave matter or not, the Catholic Church must be false, or its moral teaching must be false. Is that correct, or am I don't want to straw man it, though. I want to make sure that you approve of the way that I'm understanding your argument.
Yes. Yeah, I would put it this way, that everything on they disagree, right on. The actual entailments, like the so what, I think I titled the videos like, and it's a problem. I don't know if I would have like a direct argument that it means Catholicism is false, or just that the moral teaching apparatus isn't clear, or what the exact like end goal is, other than it seems like a problem that they don't know what'll send you to hell.
Sure. Okay, yeah, I think I understand. So I would point to, maybe this is an odd thing to point to, but in the 1940s and 50s, Einstein and Schrodinger and all these other guys that were studying quantum physics for the first time had radically different understandings of how wave-particle duality and how entanglement and how all these things worked, right? Einstein is famously quoted as saying, God doesn't roll the dice, right? And, in the, oh man, help me out here, Bell's theorem, I think is who it was, determined that there was information that was traveling faster than the speed of light, right? So Einstein was wrong and Schrodinger was right. Yay. But the point is that these are two genius men who are disagreeing about one of the finer points, one of the finer nuances of quantum physics, and one turned out to be right and one turned out to be wrong. Or you look at mathematics, or you look at chemistry, you look at any science, any legitimate science, the further that you get away from the principles, the more that it becomes a little bit cloudy, for a time at least, right? And then clarity arises whenever some new experiment or something vindicates a certain person's position. So it really shouldn't surprise us that in the science of morality, the further that you get away from the principles and the more that you get into particulars, the more that it becomes very difficult to judge, is this mortal, is this venial? And it's also important to keep in mind the church gives us principles, but the church ultimately is not the judge of Catholics. That's not the way it works. Jesus Christ ultimately is the judge of the entire world. So if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 4, St. Paul says, I am unaware of anything that would condemn me, right? This is a paraphrase, but it's very similar to what he says. He says, I'm unaware of anything that would condemn me, but that does not thereby justify me. The Lord is my judge, right? So whenever we're looking at this, you gave the example of ballroom dancing. It's like, what are the principles in place? Well, the principles in place are that the church teaches that any sort of voluntary lust outside, or any sort of voluntary sexual appetite outside of lawful wedlock is sinful, right? And then you move down and you have several other principles that you have to do. You have to look at the situation. You have to look at, does this type of dancing stir up the passions in a way that could be sinful, right? And so you're moving 6 or 7 steps away from the original principles. And whenever you do that, things naturally get cloudy in every science, right? In every science. So in a natural science, we would have something like Bell's theorem, which vindicated Schrodinger and proved that, and by the way, if I'm saying any of the names or any of the dates or any of the facts wrong, I haven't studied this in a couple years. This was just the first example that came to my mind. So be merciful if I'm getting some of the facts wrong, but I think
the principle stands.
The principle stands. That's what I'm hopefully trying to illustrate here. But through natural science, you have an experiment that vindicates one person or the other, and in the moral science for the church, you would have an official act of the magisterium that would clarify, right? So there's more that I have to say on that, but if you have anything you want to add to that point, then please go ahead.
Yeah, so I would agree with you that in natural sciences, they have historically disagreed, and even to this day, disagree in the nuance. But I think the issue in Catholicism is that if the church said, the world's gray out there, moral decisions are really tough, and in a very Protestant ooh-woo type of way, like, God is your judge, so make good decisions, I think is a framework that's consistent. But a framework that says that you can go to hell for very specific things, or that we have very well-defined things on what constitutes grave matter, that it's not just, hey, we disagree and we have a way to investigate, but that for somebody to go through their life not knowing what can or can't send them to hell seems to have terrible effects on people's mental health, and is mutually exclusive within the magisterium. For example, on let's say my side of the aisle on atheistic philosophy, like, people are going to have disagreements, and that's cool, but we don't say at the end of the day, like, and if you're wrong, you're going to burn alive for billions of years. But it seems like in a Catholic moral framework, if we agree that at least at least some people go to hell to burn for billions of years, and there's very particular sins that the Catholic Church pronounces on, it seems problematic that Catholics can mutually, or exclusively and mutually disagree on things that can't really be disagreed upon, because something can't be, to bring up Schrodinger again, like, how can something both be a mortal sin and also not be a mortal sin at the same time and disagree on it with such eternal consequences? I don't know if that point makes sense.
No, yeah, that's kind of what I was anticipating you would say. So yeah, let me just lay this out a little bit. Maybe I can make an analogy from the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, I think there's 613 laws, if I remember correctly, and they have to do with how you kill goats, how you sprinkle blood, the type of food that you can and cannot eat. Turns out ostrich is not kosher, right? So there's this long list of rules, and they all have meaning, right? I'm not trying to trivialize the Word of God. They're all important. They're there for a reason. But to us modern readers, it sounds a little strange. Why does it matter that why can I not eat eagle, but I can eat chicken or whatever? You know, it's like a little bit weird. But the point is that there are, in the old law, 3 types of laws, right? So there are laws that are moral laws, which are considered binding throughout all space and time. For example, the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are equally binding on us today as they were on the Jews in the time of Moses. There are ceremonial laws, which have to do with slaughtering goats, sprinkling blood, the way that we worship God. And then there are judicial laws, which have to do with the government of the Jewish nation, right? So of those 3 types of laws, only one of them is immutable and cannot change, and that is the moral law. So if we look at that and we try to bring this idea of these different types of laws that have binding consequences in different places and different times, in the Old Testament, it was the case where eating pork intentionally, eating a piece of bacon intentionally, would break your relationship with God because that was directly condemned for that time in that place. Whereas in the New Testament, Christians eating bacon, nobody thinks that's an issue anymore, right? So whenever you are looking at these laws, it's important to keep in mind that the church is trying to govern according to the culture, and there is flexibility in the way that the laws manifest themselves, not in the principles, right? The 6th commandment is always binding everywhere throughout all space and time. But in the, let's say, when St. John Vianney was alive in the, what was that, 16th century, I believe? 17th. whatever it is. But
I've seen this incorruptible heart, so whatever it was a long time ago.
It's been a minute, yeah. But whatever the case is, in that time period, the cultural association with dancing was much more negative, and the church, as a cautious mother, wanted to sway people away from that, whereas now the cultural ramifications of that may be different. So it gets very, very, very nuanced very quickly, and the bishops are trying to accommodate as much as possible in order to save souls, while not imposing burdens that are too heavy for people to carry. And you end up with like, oh, can I wear the, it gets very, very scrupulous. People that are tend towards scrupulosity can end up in a very bad spot. So you have to keep in mind that the rules are binding, but some of the rules can change. For example, I forget which ecumenical council this is. It's one of the earlier ones from the first millennia, but they say that Christians ought not to do any business with Jews, right? That's a law that they manifested in that time, in that place, because they thought that that was prudent for the salvation of souls in that area. Nobody considers that rule to be binding anymore, right? If you go to a grocery store and buy, kosher salt from a Jewish guy, nobody thinks that's a problem anymore. So the rules can change, right? But the principles behind the rules cannot change. So I hope that makes sense. And I know that you'd be like, well, the rules don't matter. No. The rules matter because there's a real authority that comes from God to the bishop, to the priest, right? And then down to you. So the rules do matter. And if you violate the rules, you are directly opposing the authority of God. But at the same time, those rules can change based on the cultural norms of society and things like that. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, so two thoughts on that. One, it seems problematic that they can change because it's not clear what is changeable and what is unchangeable. First there's that. Second, then it would seem, if that was the case, but all Catholics were in unison about those changes, it would make more intuitive sense. Because to bring up two examples, Father David Nix, who's big into the traditional movement, has a blog article about what are the mortal sins that all Catholics are missing in confession. And he brings up doing any amount of shopping on Sunday, and one of the other examples is wearing yoga pants in any context. And that those are definitely 100% mortal sins. And then you have on the other side, to bring up another example, within the traditional movement, it's split over what sexual acts can married couples do, and there's actually a Catholic Answers controversy back when they had the forum back in the day, over Trent Horn promotes that married couples can do certain acts as foreplay, but must finish in a certain way. But that seems to go against what St. Alphonsus Liguori and a number of other doctors of the church, as well as a large percent of current traditional Catholics. And it's not just a disagreement where they disagree about the fact that they can disagree. They disagree in a mutually exclusive way that's condemnatory of the other. Because if you're a traditional Catholic, you're looking at Trent Horn and saying, wow, he's allowing for grave sin and he's leading people to hell. And then in the opposite way, both Trent Horn and people like Christopher West are going to go, a large percentage of trads, they don't really understand the magisterium and are condemning people unnecessarily, which could also be condemnatory. And so, like I said, one, it seems weird that things can change, but then two, if they could change, and to bring another example into this, Mormons have kind of a similar idea of doctrine versus discipline, except it's never clarified which is which, because things change. For example, people of color not being able to become part of the priesthood was a long time understood to be doctrine, but then once it switched and it was like, oh, it's just discipline. So it seems like we have this amorphous soup, but with the potential liability of hell at the end and in a mutually exclusive way.
Yeah. So a couple things. First is that certainly there are complex moral issues that the church has not definitively ruled on yet. That's certainly the case. For example, whenever oral contraception became a thing in the 1960s, there was a time where the church had not ruled on that yet, and there was even a time where the majority of people in the church thought that the church was going to have a favorable opinion of that, and then Paul VI said, no, absolutely not, and closed the door on that, right? So certainly there are moral issues today that are brand new that the church has not yet ruled upon, right? And I don't see that as a problem per se, because there's a way that that problem can be solved. There's a solution to that problem. The church can make an official declaration here or there and close the door, and it's done, right? We have a mechanism whereby we can obtain clarity. The other thing that I would say, and this is a principle throughout Catholic theology and morality, but really it's just a natural law principle of morality, is whenever there is a question that you don't know what the correct decision is. I'll make a silly analogy here. This is just off the top of my head, but hopefully it's helpful, right? Let's say that there's a red button, and if you push the red button, there's a 1% chance that somebody could die, and like somebody just gets killed because you push the button, and a 99% chance that you get $1,000, right? You're morally obligated not to push the red button. You're morally obligated not to, because you have to weigh the risk and reward, and you're morally obligated to choose that which would do the least harm, because you don't know the outcome, right? I would argue that that same principle applies to what you do in the bedroom. Same principle applies to dancing, right? Or to all the other examples that you gave. The church hasn't officially given a de fide, dogmatic declaration, universally binding on any of these things. And so the moral principle of you are always obligated to do that which will result in the least harm, probably, right, applies in all of those cases. So that's another thing that it's like, even if two options are open to you, you're morally obligated to choose the one that seems like it will do the least harm. So that's just a couple of thoughts, but what do you think?
So let's use the example again of what married couples can and can't do as foreplay. And for the outside world watching, Catholic teaching has very specific rules around even what married couples are permitted to do. And what I've found is that there's, first let's parse this out. Would you agree that among Catholics who would say that they're faithful, adhere to the magisterium, would you say that a significant percentage disagree on the question of what married couples can and can't do in the bedroom when it comes to foreplay? Just like if you were to poll people, would you assume that there's disagreement?
That's not a conversation I have frequently, but let's assume that there's a 50-50 split. That's fine.
Mm-hmm. And would you agree that each of the sides think that, how do I say this? Do you think that those two positions are mutually exclusive?
Yeah. I think that. So what do you mean by that? Do you mean either one, like the both sides can't? What do you mean by mutually exclusive? You can use more specific terms if you want to, just for the sake of clarity. I'm not squeamish, but
okay. Yeah. So I gotta stay in line with the YouTube gods here. So for example, oral sex as a form of foreplay for married couples.
Right.
A much more traditional mind, and I know many Catholics who subscribe to this belief, and they'll quote doctors of the church historically, would say that in principle it is grave matter to engage in oral sex, even in the context of marriage, regardless of how the couple finishes in the correct way. And so it would seem mutually exclusive to say that it is always grave matter, to the opposite position, which is it's permitted as long as it's only as foreplay. Would you agree that those two positions are mutually exclusive?
Yes.
And do you think that the church has ruled definitively on that particular issue?
So usually, I'm not an encyclopedia, right? So it's possible that they have, and I have not read it. I have not found it. But St. Alphonsus Liguori, St. Thomas Aquinas, they talk about it and they treat it as something that is grave matter. Obviously, they're not the magisterium, but they are considered doctors of the church, and so their opinions carry a lot of weight. So in one way, yes, but not really, right? I don't think the church is and I could be wrong on that. If somebody knows of a papal document or something that clears this up, let me know. I'd love to read it.
And do you see that somebody might see a problem in the fact that there's disagreement about something this isn't a new issue, what married couples can and can't do. It's not a new issue. It's something that a significant percent of Catholics disagree upon, and they disagree in a mutually exclusive way, but yet the church seems ambiguous to this issue. Would you, maybe I'd put it this way, if you were God for the day, would you make your position clear on this particular issue because so many people disagree in a mutually exclusive way?
Well, I don't know what I would do if I was God. I think that this is something that the church may rule on one day, but just using the principles I've already laid out in this video, if you are questioning whether or not that form of foreplay is grave matter or not, you're morally obligated not to engage in it. right? So if somebody has let's say it's 50-50, right? That's kind of what I said earlier. It's like 50% it's a sin, 50% it's not. I don't know if it's a sin or not. Well, in that case, if you're in that boat where you're 50% yes, it's a sin, 50% no, it's not, you're obligated to side with the 50% that is less likely to cause harm. And in this case, it would be not engaging in that type of foreplay, right? So the moral principles the church gives still lead us to a solution. Maybe it's a solution that is not satisfactory for some people, or you want more clarity, but you can still come to a solution that I think you can be confident in, regardless of if the church has officially decreed on this specifically or not.
So if you think that there is an existing obligation, is that an obligation under the pain of sin to err on the side of not engaging in something that theoretically could be grave matter?
Yeah, so let's say that somebody, I think you might have mentioned this in your video. Let's say somebody is morally conflicted about if it's a sin to wear yoga pants or not, right? The same principle applies. You're morally obligated to do that which will cause less harm, probably, right? And so you're morally obligated in that case not to wear yoga pants. I'd also like to make a quick nuance here, right?
Yeah.
There can be grave matter without mortal sin, right? This is what the church teaches. It's called reduced culpability. This is where invincible ignorance comes in, all of these things. And so if somebody is, let's say, growing up in a heathen background, they have parents who have absolutely no morals, they grow up watching all kinds of bad things on TV, and they're wearing yoga pants out in public, they honestly may not know that that's a problem, right? They may not see anything problematic with that whatsoever. And God's not going around looking for reasons to just send people to hell, to damn people. Or this actually happened. Somebody I know was at a Bible study once, and somebody casually brought up, oh yeah, we all know it's a mortal sin to miss Mass on Sunday. And this guy was like, what? Like, he honestly had no idea that you were obligated under pain of sin to go to Mass on Sunday. So there is a nuance, and you made this earlier in your video, but I just want to make this clear. There's a nuance between grave matter and then grave matter that actually constitutes a mortal sin. So let's say somebody has no idea that this type of foreplay is something that's even morally problematic. They just grew up in a household where, these types of things weren't talked about. They got married. Their priest did not give them any catechesis about what is permitted and not permitted according to the church in the bedroom. They just have absolutely no idea. Well, they may be engaging in an act that's intrinsically disordered, or that is, I don't know, you can use whatever word you want. Grave matter is probably the best, and it not be held against them as a mortal sin. And this is laid out in the scriptures as well. Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2, St. Paul talks about Gentiles who do not know the gospel, and they'll be judged according to their own consciences, right? So this is why it's really important. The church gives us the principles, but God ultimately is the judge. So yeah, let me know what you think about that.
Would you see it then as a problem that very prominent Catholics err on the opposite side of you? Like I said, most of the Catholic answer is Apologist, as well as Christopher West. A lot of these big name Catholics say it is perfectly kosher for Catholics to engage in this type of foreplay. Do you see it as a problem that even among Catholic officials who say that they understand the nuances of Catholic teaching, they fall not on your side on this issue? And you, as also somebody who's prominent, or other, let's say, prominent traditionalists, disagree and say conflicting things?
Yeah, so it is an issue, but it's not an issue that I think is surprising in a lot of ways. To use the example of birth control, before the church ruled on that, a good portion, maybe the majority, I'm not sure, I'd have to look at the numbers, but a good number of Catholic theologians and faithful Catholics thought that oral contraception was going to be approved by the church, right? So once again, it goes back to the idea that maybe there is an issue that is pressing, that hasn't been ruled upon yet. That can happen, certainly. There's no dispute among Catholics or anybody else that can happen. But this is the way that it goes, is the church isn't going around just imposing rules randomly, right? The church isn't going around making definitions about Christology or Mariology randomly. It always happens that St. John Henry Newman puts it this way. He says, a doctrine is never defined until it's violated. Right? So whenever an issue arises and a lot of people are in jeopardy of losing their salvation or believing something heretical or falling into a moral trap like contraception would have been, then the church rules. So it's the motu proprio, it's the way that the church works, where it doesn't define something until it's a big issue. So if this distinction or this argument about what's permissible in the bedroom for married couples gets up to the level where the official magisterium needs to rule on it, then they will. right? So yes, it is a difficult thing, and if I were going to attack the church's position, that's probably the argument that I would make. There are certainly difficulties with some of these things not being clearly defined by the church yet, and it's causing division within the church. That happens. That's the way that church history goes. But we have a solution to that in the church, and it's a solution. You can argue, you can say it's too sluggish. People are twiddling their thumbs. This needs to be settled now. Like, it's not going the way that it should. We can make those arguments all day long, but at the end of the day, there is a way whereby we can have clarity about these moral issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the earlier point where oral sex within marriage isn't a new phenomena. It's something that's been existing for the entirety of the church, and it seems to not have ruled on it. And I think to your point that it is, I think, condemnable that it's taking so long to weigh on this issue. I think as a business owner, if two of my employees mutually or exclusively mutually disagree on a very important part of, like, what do I want done as a boss, like the speed at which I would answer those mutually exclusive positions would be in a blink of an eye. But on these bigger issues, and an issue that could be solved very quickly, like you need maybe one document to clarify this issue, seems problematic. Or another example would be what is or isn't permitted on a Sunday. I think many traditional Catholics, and to use Father David Nix's blog again as an example, going shopping for food on Sunday, he pulls out a St. John Vianney quote about how people are pushing their carts into hell by working or doing things on Sunday, engaging in commerce. And many traditional Catholics would say, hey, we can't even go to Costco on a Sunday or do yard work, whatever it is. And then let's say more of the Catholic Answers type, so a little bit more left-wing, but still like fully within Catholic orthodoxy, would say, I mean, don't unnecessarily get shifts on a Sunday, but if you want to go to Costco, it's going to be fine. Where do you fall on that issue? And do you see that as another thing that Catholics disagree upon to a significant degree?
Yeah, so to your previous point about oral sex always being an issue beforehand, maybe that's the case. I have read a fair amount of the writings of the saints, church history, ecumenical councils, all these things. You know, I'm certainly not an expert, but I don't see it as being an issue that's constantly popping up its head, right? Alphonsus Liguori there's a reason that I can only think of 2 Catholic saints or doctors that mention this. There are more, I'm certain of it, but really from all the research I've done, and I've looked into this topic a little bit on my own, with some, some depth, but I can only find 2 doctors of the church that even mention this as being a problem. And St. Thomas does it in an almost offhanded way. He's not like diving into the specifics or anything. It's just he's talking and going through, and this is one of the questions he addresses real quick. So I don't see anywhere in the tradition an indication, because, keep in mind, Alphonsus Liguori, St. Thomas, they're priests. So they're hearing confessions, right? They are intimately familiar with the problems that people are struggling with. And it just doesn't seem to be an issue that's popping up over and over and over and over again. I don't know. Maybe it is, and people just are too polite to write about it. But from my research, I haven't seen... Obviously, that action has existed since the beginning of the world. It's always been possible for that action to occur. But it seems like the church hasn't really had to dive into trying to fix that issue until recently. Even in the Canterbury Tales, right, where there's a lot of really crude sexual acts that are occurring, I'm unaware of that act occurring at any point. So it doesn't seem like that was something that people were really struggling with until recently. Perhaps I'm wrong, but that would just be one point I'd like to make. And then as far as the working on Sundays goes, so working on Sundays is definitely something that needs to be addressed, right? A lot of people do too much work on Sundays and kind of miss the point of Sundays, just according to the general mode of the church's teaching and just kind of what the tradition is. St. John Vianney, that quote about pushing your carts over a cliff into hell, right? There's all those things. Certainly a lot of people are too far on one side, but some people can be too pharisaical and be on the other side, right? And so it's definitely a spectrum a little bit that's all permissible within the church. I do see problems there, but once again, I see a solution to those problems, and that's applying the principle that I've already laid out, that if you're unsure about something morally, you're obligated to do that which would cause less harm. So if you're 50-50 on if shopping on a Sunday is a mortal sin or not, you're morally obligated not to shop. That would be the first thing, right? And the second thing would be is the church has a means whereby it can clarify these things if need be. So if working on a Sunday becomes a giant issue, goes up to the top, and the magisterium rules on it, well, then we know for certain, right? So those are the two things that I feel like I keep coming back to, is this principle of you're always morally obligated to do that which you believe will cause less harm, right? And then the other side is we have a means whereby we can come to clarity on these moral issues. So if you get those two things and you understand it, then I feel like all these, because like, let's say tomorrow Pope Francis comes out and dogmatically says it's a mortal sin to shop at Costco on a Sunday, right? Or whatever. This is absurd.
Terrible. The hot dogs are too good.
Well, then we'd know, okay, yeah, right. But then we'd know that, Father Dave Nix was right and maybe somebody at Catholic Answers was wrong. And we would just know. And the guys at Catholic Answers, they're good Catholics. They submit to the Pope. They'd be like, oh, okay, my bad. And they would move on, right? So hopefully I hope that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, so zooming out, I think on your first point of Catholics are obligated to do that which would cause less harm in principle, I think that's an interesting thing to dive into. And that's one of my, let's say, pragmatic arguments against Catholicism, is that as I've seen both myself and other people get into Catholicism, they seem to paint themselves further and further into a corner. Because, to your point, if there's ambiguity around what can or can't send you to hell, obviously, as a rational human being, you don't even want the chance of an eternal consequence. A 1% chance of an infinite torture is much more than a 50% chance of like stubbing your toe. And so what I've found as people become more traditional or start reading more church documents is that there is more and more ambiguity on these what seem like normal human activities. And then you hear some saint at one point or some doctor of a church or some old papal encyclical, and then you're like, wait, maybe this could be a mortal sin. And then you cross like the list of things that you can do off. And so you keep retreating from the world until you essentially paint yourself into the corner about what you can or can't do. And then you get, it seems so problematic in practice for people to disagree, because then you go for the more extreme one and you become more and more extreme, and next thing you know, like you're listening to the Diamond Brothers about Bellarmine on the church committing apostasy. It just seems so, if I were God and wanting to have a plan for people's lives to make them fulfilled, I would create a lot more clarity in a way that doesn't paint people into a corner as rational human beings. And then on the second point of like, we can have certainty, and this would be a different argument on something like Kevin Non-Tradicath's shell theory or shell game theory on the magisterium, that we can't actually know for certain, seems ambiguous. But on the pragmatic point, does my point about just like the pragmatic sense of people paint themselves into a corner, does that ring true as something that you've seen before?
So, yes, I think that some people can paint themselves into a corner and take up some pretty harsh positions and then be willing to die on that hill. That's certainly the case. But I don't think that that's really something that's unique to morality or Catholicism. If you look at, I don't know, you can pick literally anything. We used physics earlier, so maybe we'll use that again. But there probably were a lot of people like, no, Einstein's right. Right? I will go to war to prove that Einstein's right about this. Or people who would say, no, Schrodinger's right. Or you could even go back and be like, is LeBron the GOAT or is Jordan the GOAT, right? You can have all these debates about all these finer points, but you can't have a debate on something as fundamental as the team with the most points wins the game, right? So as you go into more and more nuance, right, as you go away from the principles and you use the principles to reach conclusions and then use those conclusions to build new arguments, and you keep getting further and further away from the first principles of a science, ambiguity naturally arises. That's the way that it works, right? And that's just why people are more likely to get a math problem right that has one step than 7 steps. It's because the more steps that you take, the more possibility that there is for error. So it's like if you're going to critique the Catholic Church in that way, well, then you'd have to apply that same standard, I think, to something like physics and be like, well, physics isn't a good science because Einstein and Schrodinger disagreed. And people were willing to die for what Einstein believed. And they were so convinced, right? And so I don't see that as a compelling argument not to believe Catholicism's moral system and moral science. I see that as a compelling argument that could destroy every branch of science, right? Because, you know, physicists love to argue. And sometimes I've seen some debates where physicists love to get a little bit heated. They say some things that they probably shouldn't, right? But physics is still a good science. It's still something that you can study. You can learn the principles, you can master them, and you can become a physicist, right? So I hope that makes sense. Maybe that doesn't answer your question directly, but yeah, what else do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If in Catholicism there weren't these eternal stakes, for example, in how do we look at quarks and what exactly makes up a proton and a neutron? Yes, there's historically been debate, and even to this day, if you really get into the weeds, I have a few friends that are engineers. I live by a big engineering school. Like, they do get passionate, they do get heated, and they disagree. Except in a pragmatic sense, they can go about their day because really on a macro level, like the idea of quarks doesn't affect how you marry and how you go through life and what sports you do and in governmental functions. But in Catholicism, your disagreements aren't just how we're looking at different documents, or historians disagree on a lot of things, but not in this like, and if you're wrong about it, you're going to be burned alive for billions of years. And so in a very interpersonal way that I think a lot of the harm, there's both the intellectual problem with it, but then also the in principle interpersonal harm, which is the number of Catholics that I saw, both myself and other people when I was in the church, who would endlessly have scruples about these normal activities in a way that caused them such mental duress that in such a prominent way that if I were God, I would go like, hey, let's clarify this so people can stop screaming at each other and fearing every little thing is going to send them to hell. Because if hell is literal, and to your point, if there's a chance of it going to hell, absolutely err on the side of not potentially being liable to hell. But it seems to, the only logical conclusion to the reality and imminence of heaven and hell seems to be spending your entire life focusing on these old documents from both the church and doctors of the church in a way that seems to like destroy lives.
Yeah, so a couple things. One is that God is not opposed to there being a lack of clarity in certain things sometimes, because that's part of the way that he sanctifies his saints, part of the way that he tests their faith and gives them an occasion to grow in that faith. I'm trying to think of a specific example here from the lives of the saints. Maybe Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa might be a good example, right? Mother Teresa, according to her confessor, who brought this out after she had died, obviously she didn't want the publicity or anything like that while she was alive, but after she had passed away, her confessor revealed, as part of her canonization trial, you know, all that goes on. They have to look at the writings of the saints, look at their lives, look at people who knew them, interview people if they're still alive, all these things, and figure out if this person really was a saint or not. But while that investigation was going on, Mother Teresa's spiritual director revealed that Mother Teresa spent 40 years of her life in anxiety and in darkness and in spiritual dryness. And she felt like God was far away from her, and she didn't know what she was supposed to be doing a lot of the time. And that's what was going on in her interior life while she was accomplishing all these miraculous, almost miraculous things in India, right? So why does that help God to make saints? Well, there's a principle here that has to do with it's probably the most fundamental principle in all of theism, right? And that's the idea that God created rational beings with a free will for the sake of them sacrificing their free will to his. That's why the universe exists, is for the sake of rational creatures sacrificing their free will to his. And for Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, that sacrifice was meant to be made joyfully. It was meant to be something that was natural and something that they wanted to do. But now after the fall, we have adverse inclinations, concupiscence, fallen natures, etc., and now we have to work a little harder to accomplish that purpose of the entire universe. So whenever you're looking at prayer or you're looking at any of these decisions that bring about anxiety, it's oftentimes the case that God wants you to surrender your will perfectly to his, even in anxiety, even with uncertainty, even with a lack of clarity, to continue to surrender to him and to trust in him, knowing that he will deliver you ultimately, right? And I know that we'll probably disagree about this fundamentally.
Yeah.
Just based on our worldviews here. But I absolutely do not think it's the case that God is silent in the lives of believers. If you honestly inquire of God on bended knee, praying in humility, right? Trusting that he speaks, yes, through the writings of the saints, yes, through your parish priest, yes, through your confessor, trusting all these things, God does not remain silent, but he will reveal his will to anybody who's asking for it persistently, patiently, and humbly, right? So we're talking about all these principles, and as you go more and more down the line, I mean, it gets really nuanced. So for example, one of the debates even in traditional Catholicism is if oral sex is a sin, if the husband will fornicate or commit some unnatural act if the wife does not perform that, right? So it's basically, is it permissible to engage in that activity for the sake of preventing your husband to sin? And it gets really, really complicated and nuanced very quickly. I mean, it becomes very difficult. But I do not think the difficulties are the difficulties, so to speak. It's like there are these difficulties, but we have the magisterium, we have the principles that I've already laid out, and then we also have the fact that God does speak to people in prayer. And I know that sounds, it's not voices, it's not like an angel appears in the room usually. I mean, maybe. Hasn't happened to me. If it's happened to you, let me know, right? But
a few more rosaries and you'll be there.
Right, maybe, God willing. But the point is that I do think that God does speak to people in a way that they can hear if they learn how to listen.
Yes, I would be inclined to lean that way if we knew what his will was, or that his will wasn't revealed in mutually exclusive ways. Because it is kind of, you can retreat to that interior silence, and God will kind of give you answers, but it seems like the answers that people say that God gives disagree, or even maybe zooming out of why I find this to be a problem, is that it's not clear what isn't clear. And what I mean by that is a lot of traditional Catholics, or Catholics in general, will say like, the church is pronounced definitively on, let's say, trans issues. But we know from infinite human dignity, we know that sex changes in some of the recent commentaries from cardinals, that those occasionally can be allowed. And historically, there seems to be silence. But then on the idea of like capital punishment, maybe call me a rad trad on this one, but it sure seems like Pope Francis flipped this script entirely on this has historically been permitted, but all of a sudden, because we have prisons, now we can never use capital punishment. And so it seems like all of these issues, or on non-Catholic worship, or what is or isn't a heresy, or how is it that the church works, or what rules from the apostolic penitentiary do we have to follow, and what's binding and what's not binding. It seems like everything's up in this gray area, except for on a handful of very niche issues. And even contraception is something that has a lot of ambiguity around. Can we use the principle of double effect to take hormonal birth control so as to prevent something like preeclampsia or PCOS or some other medical conditions? Or can we, on ideas like abortion and ectopic pregnancies, like there's so much ambiguity around all of this, but yet the sale of the Catholic Church is that, hey, we have answers. But in my own experience of looking through these big moral issues, it seems like there's ambiguity on these non-ambiguous topics, but the only thing like traditional Catholics can agree upon is like no gay marriage and no late-term abortion. Seems like the only non-controversial things, but then you look to the liberal side of the church and they throw wrenches in the opposite direction. So it seems like this melee of condemning people within the same system to hell over ambiguity around what is or isn't ambiguous seems contradictory.
Yeah, so to your point, I think that there is, I think if you asked anybody, is the Catholic Church okay with oral contraception, even within marriage? Anybody who knows what the church teaches, even to a small degree, is going to be able to say, no, the church is not okay with that. And if you do that, that violates your relationship with the church. It severs it, right? Or if I said, is homosexuality considered a sin by the Catholic Church? Anybody who knows what the Catholic Church teaches would say, yes, the church considers that a sin. Or if you go into, I mean, there's 1,000 different examples of where the church has a very clearly defined system. Because the objection, I get this from Protestants too sometimes, is that there's no defined list of essential doctrines or something like that. And it's like, okay, maybe that's the case. I would object to that a little bit, but maybe that's the case. But even then, are Catholics morally obliged to believe in the Immaculate Conception? And every Protestant on the planet who knows anything about Catholicism is going to say, yes, right? It's like the church can clearly define this or that. But as soon as you define this or that, and you solve the problem, so to speak, naturally 5 more problems arise, right? So if you define that oral contraception is incorrect and it's not something that you can use, well, then naturally it's the case where it's like, okay, we know that this is wrong, but is this wrong in this situation for health benefits, for, all these other things? And then it goes into more nuance, and then you define that, and then 3 new problems arise, right? It's like, that's the way that it works in almost every science. People didn't even realize that quantum physics existed until they got to a certain point in the science, and then they thought they'd solved everything, and the more they kept solving, the more they realized, whoa, all these ambiguities keep popping up. I don't even know what a particle is anymore. What is going on, right? So it's natural in every science that as you keep making discoveries and keep making progress, new questions arise. So once again, I don't see that as an objection against Catholicism specifically. I see that as an objection against science as an endeavor. And to the point about eternal damnation being a consequence, well, then you fall back on the principle of if there is a 50-50 ball, like let's say that in 1964, 1964, there's a couple that's married and they're Catholic and they're considering using oral contraception to space out the births of their children. And they don't know if it's a sin or not because the church hasn't officially ruled on that yet. Well, it's quite simple. You just apply the principle of you're morally obligated to do that which will cause the least harm, which in this case would be not using this new form of contraception that you're not sure if it's morally okay or not. And then as that progresses and as it becomes more of a problem, the church gets involved, and then Paul VI rules and says, no, oral contraception is incorrect. It's intrinsically evil. It's not something that you can use even within the confines of marriage. And then you just keep going, right? So all these 50-50 balls that you keep pointing out, right? Certainly there are complex moral issues, and certainly sometimes people in good faith make mistakes about these moral issues, right? But this goes down to, once again, you choose that which causes the least harm. That's one. Two is you need to follow the advice of your priest or your bishop or your pope, right, on issues of prudence and things like that. So there's real ways that you can come to solutions on what you ought to do in every single one of those cases, even though they're difficult, and even though sometimes people in good faith might make mistakes.
Yeah, and I think that's an internally consistent way to look at it. I think to throw my closing words on this discussion, it's very much like I talked about at the example. If you live in a state which has capital punishment as a potential for particular crimes, if we lived in a society where there was disagreement among judges, among police officers, among juries over speeding tickets, fudging your taxes, stealing a candy bar, things like assault or assault with a deadly weapon or first-degree intentional murder or homicide, it would be impossible to pragmatically go through the world where you didn't know if going 1 mile an hour over the speed limit, which is technically a crime, could get you capital punishment. Or if you go to the store and you throw 3 candy bars in to go to the Costco example, but you accidentally don't scan one of them, you technically just stole. And crap, what if last week I accidentally stole and at any point in the future I could be executed by the state, but then the state doesn't even know because there's not an appeals process and there's ambiguity because we see the law as an evolving field. It seems so impractical and burdensome and a terrible life to go through where you don't have clarity. Even if you have the potential for clarity, it seems like in actuality we don't have that clarity, and it seems, like a terrible way to live, which is always a great argument in conversation. Where you're like, I don't have let's say a logical argument, but it just seems exhausting. It's always an interesting wrench to throw in there. Those are my closing thoughts. It's an impractical, harmful, and burdensome way to live, to the point where if I were an intelligent being, I would certainly clarify those things. But I think that's probably all of the points that I wanted to hit. I don't know if you want to have the closing word and then tell people where they can connect with you and learn more about these issues.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Cade. Definitely enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate just your charity and, listening to my points and everything. I know that people oftentimes disagree and it gets emotional and heated, and I have no desire to do any of that, no shouting matches. And so I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate your tone. Just thank you sincerely. God bless you. But my closing point here, I think, would be just to counter that, is that if you view God the way that Luther and Calvin view God, then that's probably the logical solution. That's basically what Luther was doing. Luther was like, everything I do is a mortal sin. I'm going to hell. He would go to confession multiple times. And so he couldn't keep up with it. He couldn't keep up with his own fallen nature because he just didn't understand that God was a loving father. His own father, right? I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Luther's own father beat him and was very harsh and very severe. Luther in his own writings said that once he took a nut off the dinner table, he just took it as a little kid because he wanted to eat it, and his father beat him, quote, until the blood flowed. right? So whenever Luther looks at God the Father, he looks at God the Father as somebody as, if you take that nut off the table without my permission, I'm going to beat you until you are black and blue, boy. That's how Luther views God the Father. And if you view God the Father that way, then all these rules, all these impositions, all these moral dilemmas are going to cause you to lose your mind. Absolutely. But that's not the Catholic paradigm at all. The Catholic paradigm views God as a loving Father who chastises those who he loves so that they can become better, right? So I have 2 kids now, and my 2.5-year-old, her name's Celine. She's wonderful. She makes mistakes, and we have to punish her and discipline her because we're not going to let her just run the roost. We're not going to let her do whatever the heck she wants. But these disciplines,
no infinite candy for her.
Yeah, right. But all of these things are because we love her, and if she makes a mistake, we're going to try to correct her and bring her closer to what she's supposed to be, and not just come down with the full maximum extent of the law. So it sounds like the problem that you're addressing is a much more Lutheran, Calvinistic, Protestant, and certainly some Catholics hold this view, which is a problem, but it's a very harsh understanding of God rather than viewing him as a loving Father. Because I started this by saying the distinction between mortal and venial sin is like your relationship with your spouse, right? Your relationship with your God should be, in a certain sense, much more intimate even than your relationship with your spouse. There should be a lot more communion there, a lot more mercy, a lot more warmth and kindness, all of these things. And if you just view God as a judge or as a punisher, then you completely are missing the point, right? This is why St. Paul says, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And the Spirit of God is fundamentally a spirit of understanding the love and the compassion of the Father. So those would be my closing words, but yeah, thanks again for having me on, Cade.
And where can people follow you and watch some of your content?
Yeah, if you want to see some of the stuff that I do, I have a YouTube channel called Cameron Riker. I bring people on fairly often, Protestants, dating coaches, psychologists, all kinds of things, and I'm having discussions with them, as well as I do some basic Protestant apologetics, and yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Well, I think there's an infinite number of rabbit holes we could go down, and even just on one discussion. So I think we'll end the conversation there. And for people listening, to support this work and make it all possible, I have my Patreon, and for a whole $1 a month, you can join our Discord to dive into these conversations. If you are a recovering or a questioning Catholic or want to have some questions answered, feel free to support the work and make all this possible, because all of this fancy lighting is not cheap, as I think every YouTuber finds out that gear is the infinite rabbit hole that you can always buy more of. But yeah, this has been a great discussion, and perhaps we'll have more in the future.
All right. God bless you, Cade. Thank you again.